Glenn Drury, welcome into the weeds. Fantastic to have you on the podcast. Really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us about politics, what you do, who you are. The federal election coming up in 2025,
soon, yeah.
very, very soon. It's imminent. You're a bit of an enigma, the preference whisperer. So tell us a little bit about you, where you're from, before you sort of came to attention in public life.
It's good to see you. Thanks for having me on. You know, we've you and I have had a relationship going back how long? Years?
Yeah,
Decades?
Decades. I think it's it's into the decades.
We've had a few public punch-ups.
Yep.
But it's all been fun.
Yep.
And I remember just a few years ago when you were in the New South Wales Parliament with the Greens. I got off a flight from the US and I had all these texts. Jeremy Buckingham has unleashed on you in the upper house. And whoa. So somebody sent me a link from Hansard. And, of course, I'd been on the plane while this was happening. And you must dig up that speech. I'd love to see it again. You were using the words of the movie Alien. Do you remember that?
I do. I think I was using the game over, game over.
Game over, that's it. And
game over. Someone tell Glenn Drury that the group voting tickets is over.
It must have been in 2016.
I think it was.
And I had my phone out and I was waiting to get through immigration and I was there chuckling and the border guard, the security guy, the guy that, these what do we call them? The guy that welcomes you back to the country, usually with a frown and a grumpy
strip search.
Yeah, says, you shouldn't have that phone out. And anyway, sorry, that just came to mind.
No, that's good. That's good. Yeah, look, I've known you for a long time. You've been, as I say, a bit of an enigma. People know the name Glenn Drury. You're often referred to as the preference whisperer. I call you the preference pirate.
Yes. But, some people call me the preference wanker, but that's another story.
But I'm interested to know about you before you got involved in politics, and
like back at band camp.
Well, how did you end up becoming a political operator, a political consultant?
We go back that far. Well,
yeah, I think people are interested in.
People say to me, "When did you get into politics? What inspired you to get into politics?" When I was a little boy. I'm talking 5, 6, 7 years old. My father would say to myself and my brother, usually over Sunday lunch, because we're all sitting down as a family, there'd be ice cream on the table. And, I knew Dad's game. He'd say, who wants an extra scoop of ice cream or a bigger scoop of ice cream? And I do. And there's competition between us. And he'd ask me to in a minute or 2 minutes, tell me why it's good to have extra homework at school. And I had to phrase this debate into such a way that I'd beat my brother and I'd get the extra ice cream. At the end of the day, Dad was, he'd always give us the same thing. But Dad taught me to think as a little boy. And I think for me, all those years ago, sitting around that lunch table was the beginning of me taking an interest in politics because my dad taught me how to think. And I remember many, many years later, my dad died in 2017, and in those last weeks and months, I actually moved back into my childhood bedroom. My Pink Floyd poster was still on the ceiling. and it was a lovely time. I was there with Dad and helped him get through that period of morbidity and ultimately death. And Dad said to me just a few days before he died, he said, what on earth made you get into politics? I get a bit emotional thinking about this now. And I said, well, you did, Dad. You're the greatest politician I've ever met. You. And he just grunted. So I guess that was the beginning of politics for me in an informal sense. But I think your question was perhaps aimed at more the formal position of when I got into politics. I started to take a real interest in politics in my early 20s. And I joined the Young Liberals. Yes, Young Liberals. And I was quite conservative in those days. Over the years, I've had a quantum shift, a quantum change. And the more time I spend in politics, the more time I realise that the Conservatives are not good for people. They're great for corporations. They're great if you're very wealthy. But it was something of an evolutionary journey for me to understand, and I've worked in parliaments, New South Wales Parliament, Victorian, West Australian, federal, of course, that often the legislation put up by so-called liberal governments isn't put up to benefit people. They argue that it is, and I think of John Howard, who to me is our version of Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher. He was a very good politician. And I'm not talking about his philosophical approach now. I think he was a disaster for this country, and his mistakes are generational. And I think of one thing that comes to mind when John Howard talked about education. And he wants parents to have the right to choose. Oh, that sounds good, right? We all want the right to choose. But what he meant by that was he wanted to privatise education. And his vision was for a 50-50 private, 50-50 public-private situation. We ultimately got about two-thirds, one-third private, two-thirds public. He was trying to Americanise our education system, our childcare system, our aged care system, and he did a pretty good job of it. I mentioned my father recently and my input into Dad in those last weeks and months of his life. And I also had a lot of input into my mother's, final months and years. And part of that was I developed an understanding of how aged care works in this country. It can be hideously expensive. It's been corporatised thanks to John Howard. My daughter, who works in childcare, those who've got children will understand that it costs an absolute fortune to send your child to childcare. It's been corporatised thanks to John Howard. So while my beginning in politics was one of a conservative journey, it's moved into something of a progressive journey now, because I've seen what these people have done. And a lot of my conservative friends won't like me saying this, but I don't think that conservatism is good for people.
That's really interesting, because look, we'll get to this later on, because at the moment you're working for Senator Fatima Payman.
I work with Senator Fatima Payman, yeah.
Yeah, you're working with her as a key advisor, put you in a very powerful role in the Australian Parliament, the Australian Senate. But your sort of entree, I think the first time you became to the public attention was as a preference negotiator for some of the minor parties.
Back in 1999.
1999.
We're sitting in Macquarie Street doing this now, and just to our backs, a couple of 100 metres away, is the New South Wales Parliament. I can talk about that if you will like, how it happened. Okay.
Yeah, I'd really like to hear about that, because there was a perception in the community that there were operators who were, to coin a phrase, gaming the system, that they were using negotiations to get certain people elected.
This is true. The major parties have been gaming the public since Federation. And then I come along, the first person to do this, and educate the public on how ordinary people can get in, and of course the establishment that the major parties control. Oh, he's gamed the system. He's somehow rigged the system. It's not democratic. It's wrong to have choice and diversity in parliaments. Rubbish. Absolute nonsense. And I'm very, very proud of all of the so-called ordinary people, everyday Australians that I've helped put into Parliament. And that began in the New South Wales Parliament in 1999. And I can talk a bit about that journey if you like.
I'd love to. I think the listeners and the viewers would love to.
Okay. Well, as I said, I've had something of a quantum leap in my philosophical view of the world. So what I believed back then is not necessarily what I believe now as to why I started and how I started. And how I got started was not long after the 1995 election. Were you in Parliament then?
No.
You weren't. No, you weren't.
I got elected in 2011.
Of course. Okay. So the Carr government was elected in 95 on the promise to introduce a whole bunch of wilderness areas, which at the time I thought was wrong. I have a very different view now, of course, but let's talk about what happened. And I could see what was coming. I could see that a lot of these areas that I was taken to as a child I wouldn't be able to take my children there. And I felt that was not appropriate. So I took it upon myself to go and speak to user groups, bushwalking groups, mountain bike groups, full drivers, horse riders, fishing people, and so on. And I thought I was changing the world. I really did. I thought, look, these people, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to fix this. Of course, nothing was happening, right? Nothing was happening. And then in 1990, gosh, when was it? 1997, National Parks and Wildlife Service took heavy equipment into the Wollamai National Park, not a long distance from where the Wollamai Pines are. And they used this mining type equipment to rip up the trails, chop down trees, pull boulders out of the sides of tracks to block people getting into the national park. And that just flipped me out. I thought that was really wrong. And that is wrong, right? That's wrong. So I one-man show back to all of these user groups, look at this, and showing them pictures and so on. And people were outraged. And I thought, yeah, we're going to fix this. Nothing happened, mate. Nothing. So there was despair. I'd spent the last 12 months thinking I'm going to change the world. With hindsight, I was very naive, of course. And I more or less, I gave up. I didn't understand what to do next. And then out of the blue, I had a nail bag on. I had a planer in my hand, and I was hanging a door at my house. Of course, I'm a carpenter by trade, and I love swinging a hammer. I just didn't, it's great therapy for me these days. And I got a phone call just out of the blue. And I don't remember this person's name, but she said, I'm John Laws' producer. I'm like, John Laws? Why on earth would I want to talk to that guy? And we want to talk to you about your photos. And photos? I'm thinking, what photos? What photos? But I played along, and she talked about the damage in Wollamai National Park. Like, oh, somebody sent John Laws photos of the damage in Wollamai National Park. So she said, pretend that you're a talkback caller, that we didn't contact you. Like, oh, okay. Well, this is my very first media. We're talking at 1990, I think it was 96. And I said, oh, when do you want to talk to me? Thinking it'll be, later in the week. And she said, in 2 minutes, your next call. Like, so I'm standing up with a phone that's got sawdust all over it with a nail bag on. There's the door, I'm hanging just there. And John Law says, yes, hello, caller. And I said, oh, John, thanks for ringing. Like, oh, shit, there's my first mistake. First meeting mistake, right? And, John Laws with his massive ego probably didn't like that. But, and so began this conversation. Now, John had an ulterior motive at that time. He was hammering Pam Allen and Kim Yaden, Pam being the Environment Minister and Kim Yaden was, I think, Water and Resources Minister. And I was just a tool for John. I didn't know that at the time.
A tool with a tool bag.
Yeah, indeed. But a couple of minutes into this, I'd found my feet. It was going well. And I was getting pretty fired up. And I was playing into John's hands, of course. He's a very experienced operator. I challenged the minister to a debate. And John loved that. Yes, come on, Minister Allen, come on the show, and this young fella will debate you.
And back then, John Laws was a big player.
He was number one.
Number one in Australia.
This was going all over Australia, by the way.
Yeah.
Not just Sydney. And we spoke for nearly half an hour. It just went on and on and on. And I was really into this. This is good fun. And the call was coming to an end, and I could go back to finish hanging my door. And then John said, well, what are you going to do now? And what do you mean, what am I going to do? I didn't say this. I'm thinking, what do you mean, what am I going to do now? What's next? What are you going to do? You've got to keep this going. And so this just came to me. I've organised a rally on the weekend. There was no rally. This is on a Wednesday, right? There was no rally. And I thought with that, and I could say, yeah, anyway, thanks, John. No, John said, what rally? Where? Like, oh my God, there is no rally. And Macquarie Park at Windsor came to mind because my grandparents used to take me there in summer and we'd swing on a rope and, it was a wonderful place then. I said, oh, it's at Windsor. Trying to give as little information as possible so I could just get off the call. No, John, experienced journalist, starts to dig. Where at Windsor? Macquarie Park. Well, what time? Oh, no. 8:30. Great. Big rally organised by Glenn. 8:30 at Macquarie Park, Windsor this Sunday. Like, oh, shit. Oh, shit. So he started to promote it.
Did anyone turn up?
Oh, shit. I'll get to that. Then my old man, my dad rang and said, he was laughing. He said, what have you done? So I don't know, Dad. I don't know. This was in 96, right? I do this sort of stuff all the time now, but back then it was a big deal. So I've got John Laws promoting this rally. And I had little kids at the time. I turned up at my father's place about 7 o'clock in the morning with my kids and wife. And we all got in the one car and went out to Windsor. Now, I don't know how well you know the approaches to Windsor. I think is it called the Jolly Frog Pub? I'm not sure. There's a pub on the way into Windsor. There was a traffic jam which began there. And I went, oh, I wonder what's going on. Well, I'll tell you what was going on. Somebody organised a rally. Anyway, we get to a roundabout where you can almost see the Windsor Bridge. It's looking down into Windsor. And there's a copper on the roundabout. And Dad was driving, and I said, well, what's happening? And he said, some idiot has organised a rally and not told us. Like, I slunk down in my chair, like, oh. And then we could see it. There were 2 helicopters there, Channel 9 and Channel 2. John Laws had been pushing this all week long. Part of his issue on dealing with the car government, which he didn't like, and Pam Allen, and he saw me as a vehicle to hurt them. Channel 9, Channel 2 estimated there was somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 people and showed up. So we eventually got across there. There's people everywhere. It just felt like mayhem, obviously, because nothing had really been organised. And there was a bloke who had just shown up. I didn't know this guy. He was a farmer with a tabletop truck with watermelons in a big cage at the front, just behind the cab. I mean, I remember this like it was yesterday. I was so incredibly nervous. The only public speaking I'd done at that point was at my wedding, and that was a disaster, right? So this he's got a PA system, and he's just saying in this monotone,
and watermelons. What were the watermelons for?
Well, he was a farmer,
and he just had them.
He just showed up. Oh, geez, this was. I lit a match, and I'd created this raging bushfire. It was quite funny. I mean, if anybody ever wanted to put this to film, it was hysterical. And there I was with a 2-year-old-ish child on my hip, my what was it called? Whoopee? Is that what they call that? Clinging onto my kid, nervous as hell. And this farmer is standing on the back of his truck with the watermelons, saying, "Glenn, where are you, Glenn?" Oh shit! And I'm like. It was almost reminiscent of the scene when I was a little kid and Mum and Dad took me to school when I'm 5 years old, and I don't want to go. So I walked up to the dude and said, "Squeak, I'm Glenn." He said, "Well, get up here and talk to us." I'm like, "Talk to you? What about?" And I grabbed the microphone, and then it happened. It just happened. I spoke for 15 minutes and the words just came out. It was like somebody entered my head, and I had people crying. And then it happened again. We got to the end of that 15 minutes and I'm thinking, whew, thank God that's over. What an experience. I can go home. But then it happened again, like in the John Laws call. Someone said, "What are we going to do now?" And at this point I felt like Brian in The Life of Brian, I'm standing up there looking out into this sea of people. And like, what do you mean, what are we going to do now? I just want to go home. I've been a naughty boy. I want to go home. But where it came from, I don't know. I said, we're going to take the media up to the scene of the crime, to the devastation caused to our land by National Parks and Wildlife Service, and we're going to show the media. And people started to cheer. Well, I don't know if you know the Putty Road.
I do.
2-lane road, we're at Windsor, high Wallamai, 60 Ks. It was a complete disaster. Not all of those thousands of people came up, perhaps a few hundred, but that farmer came up and grabbed us and said, "Follow me," and he just took off. And we got up there long before everyone else, and you can imagine the mayhem, mate. It was just a total mess. And that was the lead story for both of the news channels, the lead story on this Sunday night. Massive traffic jam as thousands of people demonstrate what's going on in national parks and their mismanagement. Well, I think only a few hundred went up there, but then that was a story. And we got up to where national parks had scarred the landscape with this massive tailing-style mining-type operation that they'd done. The farmer set up his PA system on top of one of those pieces of earth, and we waited for an hour and a half to 2 hours for a few hundred people to show up. Cars everywhere. Cops had followed us. I mean, it was a total disaster, and yet this was the beginning. This is how it all happened.
I think that's really interesting because you started out as
a mistake.
As a mistake.
Well, no, as an accident.
An accidental messiah.
The accident, yeah.
But you were a politician. Essentially, you're an activist. You're a politician.
I didn't know that at the time.
You didn't know it. That's exactly. I think a lot of politicians who go on to, to have long careers and long involvements in politics. That's how they become accidental politicians.
This was nearly 30 years ago.
Yeah. So how did that translate into?
Well, let me just finish this story on this. And this is the beginning. It started with this idea. Then this John Laws thing happened. This was all the accidental stuff. So now we're up there standing on this slag heap created by national parks. The farmer shoves the microphone in my hand. I thought I said all I had to say back there, but again, it just flowed. It was a very emotive speech. Look at this destruction. Look at what's happening. This is just wrong. It's wrong. And then it happened again. People were cheered and clapped, and I thought, thank God it's over. It's really over now. And again, that Monty Python moment, that Life of Brian moment, when it was a woman who was standing right in front of me. I can see her now. She's, what are we going to do now? Like, oh my God, what are we going to do now? And this was the beginning. What I said now was the beginning. We're going to form a political party. We're going to get the balance of power in the upper house, and we're going to fix this. And they went mad. They screamed and yelled and cheered. And was it a week later or 2 weeks later? A week later, I think, I was in the Premier's office. Not long after that, in a helicopter with Pam Allen, flying around looking at what they called management, which I called damage. And that was the beginning. All of a sudden, the media took an interest. Anything to do with national parks, they called me. And then shortly after that...
So you were just winging it, saying...
totally.
You were just winging it on the slag heap, saying, what comes next?
I didn't know what was... It was just
from that you had no idea about how to register a political party. Nothing. Zero. Like you had no experience.
None.
And that was it. That was just...
That's how it began, mate.
That's how it began.
And then I'm in the Premier's office, and then John Tingle from the Shooters Party, who was a wily old bugger, saw me as a potential threat. I didn't understand how or why. And this is really early on, and he invited me into his office here in Macquarie Street and said, we think you're wonderful. We want you to be a shooter for a candidate for the Shooters Party. Like, I'm thinking, what? I don't even like guns. Why would I do that? And I winged it again. And I said, John, I've got a better idea. Let's encourage all these different groups to form political parties. We'll exchange preferences and we'll get the balance of power. And with that, he just snapped and he said, you're too smart by halves. Get out of my office. And that was it. That was it.
You must have had in that meeting, though, some sense of what preferences were. You must have.
Oh, I did. You must have. Okay, I've just skipped a little bit.
You must have gone and had a look at the system.
Yes.
Because not everyone goes, okay, like.
No, I've just skipped a little bit, which I'll fill in that gap.
Yeah.
A guy called Malcolm Jones. Name familiar with you?
Yeah, the Democrats, Malcolm Jones. Yep.
Non-Democrats,
Wasn't
Outdoor
he?
Recreation Party.
Oh, outdoor rec. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, the first guy ever elected, Malcolm Jones. What a mistake. What a big mistake. I met Malcolm Jones at the Range Rover Club.
Right.
Malcolm Jones, this pseudo-intellectual pommy upstart who thought he was so much better than us colonials. He just made a beeline for me. I'd given a speech at the club talking about what was going on. And through their champagne and pate, they well, what's this got to do with us, you know? And Malcolm is an opportunist. He came up to me and he said, I'm in the Liberal Party. I can't get pre-selection. I want to be a politician. Will you elect me in 99? We'll form, I'll come on board. This was part of a bigger conversation. We were leaning against his Range Rover. I was actually on the way home. It was almost another, what are we going to do now moment. Look, I'm a great opportunist, entrepreneurial type thinker, but I just hate the administrative stuff, the paperwork. Oh, my God, terrible. I'd make a lousy accountant. And that's where Malcolm turned me on. He said, you've got the ideas, you've got the strategy. I can provide infrastructure and money through these various groups I'm involved in. And naively, I said, oh, that sounds pretty good. And I shook his hand and said, yeah, I'll put you in Parliament in 99. And this is about, was it 96 or 97? It's all a bit of a blur now. It was around that, late 96, I think. And I naively just said, oh, okay, this sounds like a great idea. I can go and have all the fun and come up with all the ideas and the strategy, and he can do all the work. Fantastic. It was a huge mistake. Malcolm Jones was a 1950s style conservative. I didn't know that at the time. But he was also corrupt. He ended up facing ICAC. And ironically, the guy, me, who put him into power, I was one of the key witnesses there. He rorted is it called the Sydney Allowance, the Sydney Fund? The travel fund. He also had his staffers doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. And that's a story all in itself. But after Malcolm had asked me, just coming back to your question, how did I know about preferences? Well, I didn't at that point. But I'm big on bravado. Will you put me in Parliament in 99? Oh, yeah, no worries, I can do that. And I went home that night, started scratching my head. How the hell am I going to do this? Well, the internet wasn't a big thing in those days. It was around, but it wasn't a big deal. So as soon as I could after that, I went into Kent Street to the State Electoral Office. And I started asking questions. The woman in those days, her name was Monica Floyd. She was lovely, wonderful. As we got closer to the 1999 election, I'd been in there so many times doing so much. I could have worn a gorilla suit and faced backwards and she'd have said, oh, good morning, Glenn. But I purchased a copy, a big, thick yellow book. It was Anthony Green's summary of the 95 election. I figured if I'm going to learn about elections, I should see what happened in the past. And I opened it up and it's just full of words I didn't understand. Preferences, diminishing value and this and that and oh, God, what is this? First past the post versus this type of voting versus that type of voting. It was just brain fog. And nothing clicked. Nothing clicked. And I remember it was very late at night. I was in bed trying to make sense of this with this book. Some people go to bed with, novels. I went to bed with Anthony Green. Well, not Anthony Green. With Anthony Green's summary of an election. And I was just getting tired and I don't know how I'm going to do this. And I went to the back of the count. And I saw all these people who were elected and I'm flicking backwards. Within a few pages, the light turned on. Got it. I know how it works. I understand preferences. Bang. I know what to do. And I went to Malcolm Jones and I said, yep, I'm confident I can get you elected. What we have to do is contact a whole bunch of groups, desperate groups, and convince them to form political parties. And we'll exchange preferences. At that time, I said something like, half a dozen different groups. And we'll get you elected. And Malcolm Jones looked at me like I was a Martian. He said, no, that's not how we're going to do it. We're going to raise lots of money and we're going to print, this was Malcolm's version of how to get elected. We're going to print 250,000 bumper stickers. That's how we'll get elected. What? Oh. So, okay. You know, and by now Malcolm had sort of usurped this whole thing. What started out as a lot of fun was starting to go down a path that I wasn't entirely happy with.
Had you formed a political party at that point?
No, it was all an idea.
It was an idea.
It was all just an idea. And I was coming to terms with how I'm going to do this. Well, when I, got several pages into this, reading this Anthony Green summary of the 95 election, I knew it was going to work. I just knew it. But I had to have a massive infrastructure of preference vehicles for it to happen. And I went down that path. And ultimately, I don't do things by halves. I worked on that almost full time. Almost. I was just so driven. Can I beat City Hall? Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is one of my favourite movies. Can I put an ordinary person in Parliament in a system that has been rigged by the major parties to benefit the major parties? Is this possible? And I worked at it, and I worked at it, and I worked at it, and I ultimately had 21 friendly groups. Wiki says 24. No, it was 21. And that was the tablecloth ballot paper. Do you remember that?
I do. They've got one of them framed in New South Wales Parliament House.
Yes,
it's a massive.
It's almost like a shrine. Whenever I go to the New South Wales Parliament, I walk past and dip my hat.
It's a gigantic piece of paper with, I don't know how many political parties ended up
about 84, as I recall.
84 different political parties.
And of that, I had serious influence or control over, directly 21, indirectly. It's to explain how this works to, I suppose, a layperson, it's a little bit like a massive ship going down the Suez Canal, and that wash picks up all of the little boats and just sucks them along, and they've got no choice in the matter. Mathematically, that's just how it happens, right? That's a very simplistic way of describing what happened, but that's what happened. And Malcolm still didn't believe me, where he thought what I was doing was fool's gold, was folly, absolute folly. Of course, he knew he was such a superior Englishman, and what would I know? I'm from the colonies. And about a month out from the election, he attempted a coup. He attempted to get rid of me, and he started to contact all of those people I've been working with and say, "Don't trust Drury. He's in this for his own motivation. He's for his own reasons." And people started to ring me. And 95+% of them said, "We don't trust Malcolm. We're with you."
Because you must have spent a lot of time on the phone. Because
mate,
I've organised.
I lived on the phone.
I organised in a couple of political parties, and there's a lot of engagement. You have to talk. You have to talk underwater with a mouthful of marbles. You have to talk to thousands and thousands of people.
Oh, I was doing this full time.
You must have spent 18 months because
closer to 2 years.
2 years, not only convincing people of your strategy, but convincing them to take the time to get the names, because to register a political party, to get on the ballot paper is a big. It's quite a significant threshold, isn't it?
I helped with a lot of that. I learned politics has taught me a lot about people, on what motivates people, how to talk to people. And I didn't read the book about this. There was no book. I invented a lot of this stuff, and now many people have imitated and tried to copy, but none have really done it successfully. Excuse me. And I find the best way to communicate with people is begin with, what do you want? What is it you'd like to achieve? And ask a lot of questions and work with them that way, rather than, a lot of politicians, and I said this to Darren Hinch when I was his chief of staff, actually leading up to the election. Darren would go to talk to people, and he was a big supporter of this back of the bus type campaign, this old school Harry S. Truman type campaigning, which is great. It's wonderful. But often Darren would begin with, "I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that." And I said to Darren very early on, Change that. Ask them what they want. I'm here to talk to you to find out what you need. And if you vote for me, I will represent you. And people love that. As a politician, you understand that, right?
Yeah, most people think that politicians spend their lives standing on a soapbox, on a stump, behind a microphone, telling people.
Some do.
Some do, but the majority of politicians spend their lives listening to people having issues, ideas downloaded at them.
But then you've got to actually go and try and do something about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference between a good representative of the people and a bad one. Those that listen and then go and do something. Because at the end of the day, as you know, you're a veteran, Polly, now. You've been around a long time. It took me a long time to figure this bit out. I think from the tone of the conversation, you probably understand that for me, initially, politics was about numbers. It was about beating the major parties at their own game, about card counting in Vegas. I'm going to beat the House. And I did, and I still do. And it was this intellectual challenge of, can I beat them? And it took a while for me to figure out, and it wasn't until I got a full-time job up in the New South Wales Parliament, actually, that politics is about people, or it should be about people. And, over the years when I've helped people achieve things like get their bridge fixed up so that the school bus will go over it, getting grab rails in a little town somewhere in Victoria so that the elderly people can go shopping, and putting laybacks in the street so that their little, what do they call those little electric cart things?
Zimmer or...
Yeah, I mean, these are just a few examples. There's been other big picture things like being part of taking passports off convicted child sex offenders, even getting bike racks in the New South Wales Parliament. Politics is about people. It should be about people and about helping people who can't necessarily help themselves. That might sound a bit trite. I don't mean it to. But I get great satisfaction when I'm out cycling somewhere, and my partner Melissa and I love getting out bikepacking. And we did a trip out in central west New South Wales a few years ago, and I rode over a bridge in a section of road, and I stopped. She said, "What are you doing?" I looked back. I said, I think I facilitated the funds for that bridge." And that brought me a great sense of satisfaction, knowing that is for the community.
But you can't do those things unless you get into power.
Oh, yes. And I'm a great one of the things that I say to people is, unless you get your backside on that red or green leather, forget it.
Yeah, into Parliament.
And this is where I've had a lot of criticism over the years from you, from Lee Rhiannon, your good friend, and many others, but particularly the so-called staphologists, these bean counters, these people who write about what you and I do. I think of one fellow in Tasmania. What's his name? Kelvin Boneham? Is that his name?
I think it might be Dr. Kevin Bonham.
Is it? He teaches at TAFE or something like that? Does he? Or community school or something. Anyway, he and others, I pick on Kelvin because he thinks he understands what happens. But you know yourself, unless you're here, you don't really get it. And I get a great chuckle when I read some of his things. And people send me tweets. What do you think of this? What? Sorry, I'm busy painting the wall at the moment. I'll come and look at that later. But I do get a lot of criticism for what I've done because I haven't followed the mainstream, I suppose. I take an entrepreneurial, opportunistic view. Somebody will come to me, and I come back to your point and something we just said, that unless you've got your backside on that red or green leather, there is no point. So my goal is to win by whatever legal mechanism allows me to do so. And Kelvin and a lot of his so-called staphologist friends, they don't like that. They really don't like that. Somebody outside the system beating the system time and time again. It really pisses them off. And I love that.
So you did beat the system. You have elected people to parliaments across the country and the Senate too, I think.
Oh, lots.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the lower house.
And the lower house.
Let's not forget about that.
Let's not forget about that. But there must have been a eureka moment. Like, were you doing this on the back of a beer coaster? Were you doing because there must have been a moment where you said, look, I need X amount of political parties to get because essentially the way the Australian electoral system works is they count from the bottom up.
Yes.
They exclude the person who's got one vote,
Yes.
and then the 2 votes, 3 votes, and those votes essentially flow back up. They flow back
Correct.
over and tip back into other columns, other political parties.
Yeah.
There must have been a moment where you were sitting there going, I need 15 political parties. I need for them to exchange preferences and each one to get X amount. Was there a formula that you a magical formula, an algorithm that you essentially came up with that you put in your back pocket? Or?
Yes, but no. Now, the conspiracy theorists, I've just mentioned Kelvin in Tasmania and some of his other friends around the place, think there's some type of conspiracy there where I sat down with, who knows, somebody and figured all this out. No, I stumbled into it, mate. I wasn't formally educated into, I laugh at the term political science. Political science. It should be political art. There's not a lot of science about politics, in my view, about what I've done. I figured it out as I was going along. I invented the system. Anthony Green first called it preference harvesting, and that's what I was known as, by the way, until 2013, the preference harvester.
Oh, so
I didn't invent these terms.
Yep.
Anthony Green called me that, and the media picked up the preference harvester. And then in 2013, The Guardian, what was her name now? I forget the journalist's name. She referred to me as the preference whisperer, and it's been that way ever since. What I really love, you might be able to help me with this, an ism. Druryism, Glenisms in politics. How do I become an ism, mate?
I think it's an ideology, don't you?
Is it?
It's like
I say that tongue in cheek.
capitalism.
I pronounce it capitalism.
Maybe it's just opportunism.
There's a large degree. You have to be, to win elections, you must be opportunistic. You've got to be entrepreneurial in your thinking. You've got to be very flexible. So I come back to
because essentially you still need to have political parties that someone out there votes for, because it can be a clever name, or it could actually capture a sentiment in the community. So you must have spent a lot of time sitting there going, what are we going to call this political party? A lot is in the name and the logo.
Look, yes, and in the early days I just stumbled into, I was a bull in a china shop. If in doubt, I'll have more. Hence 21 political parties.
What were some of the political parties?
Well, I wanted to capture the whole gamut. So I had a pro-Badgerys Creek Airport party and an anti-Badgerys Creek Airport party.
Badgerys Creek was
it was a big deal. We're talking about in the 90s, right?
The 90s.
Now Badgerys Creek Airport's being built, of course, but back then it was a big deal.
Now it's like Western Sydney Airport.
Yeah, and I think of a rather funny moment.
So you ran a political party for, a political party against.
Correct. Remember, you said I'm opportunistic? Yeah, absolutely. My goal was to win. I saw a wrong happening and I had to fix it. And I'm not going to concern myself with these so-called rules. I'm going to invent my own. And that's what really pisses off the mainstream. And all of their parts like these, I mentioned Kelvin and even to a lesser extent Anthony Green and others. I can recall Anthony Green on ABC, while he didn't mention my name, yelling and screaming that these people have got to be stopped. What these puppets are saying is we want a two-party system. We don't want ordinary people in our parliaments. Well, to hell with you. To hell with you. I think diversity and choice is paramount. What do we want, a US-style system where we've got Tweedledum and Tweedledummer? I mean, look at America, for goodness sake. No. We want people like you and others, ordinary people, the school teacher, the accountant, the housewife. And I've put all of these types of people in parliaments over the years, and that's great. It brings colour and diversity. Can I use the word from the castle? And the vibe of the community.
So what were some of the other political parties?
Okay.
You were talking about Badgerys Creek.
I'll give you
give us a run through.
As I said, this thing evolved. it just evolved. I didn't read the book on how to get a nobody elected to Parliament. I had to come up with this myself. I said that I initially went out to encourage groups to register political parties to be part of this to get people elected. And it wasn't just Malcolm Jones. It was Peter Breen, Peter Wong and Malcolm Jones I elected. 3 people at that first election. And Pete Breen and I have stayed very good friends. We're still good mates today.
What was the vehicle? Was that the law?
Reform the legal system.
Reform the legal system.
In essence, Peter wanted, a Medicare type system for law. So the law was accessible to everybody. And that's a noble thing. Peter Wong, of course, was set up to respond to the racism of One Nation. Another good thing. Good thing. So the irony here is I initially started out to help Malcolm Jones, who proved to be, who was in charge of ICAC then? I don't recall the name now, but in the determination of ICAC, Malcolm Jones was a liar, was corrupt, and he's very lucky he didn't go to jail. The first guy I elected was not so good. But Pete, the two
just hold on there. We're definitely going to have to legal that one there, Pete. Just put a note. Legal asterisk.
Irene Moss, I think it was Irene Moss.
Okay.
Go and have a look at Operation Athens, and you will see where she refers to Malcolm Jones as a liar. And he was. I mean, I could talk half an hour about all of that, but getting back to
I think you just did.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Verbal diarrhea. So coming back to the names, the evolution of how I got 21 political parties that I had serious influence over, it began with me approaching an older guy to form the Seniors Party. More rights for pensioners. This is how it began. And he was struggling to get names to register the party. So I said, well, I'll help you. I'll help you. And I started going door to door, knocking on, hi, I'm helping to form a political party called the Seniors Party. Would you like to slam? Well, I got pretty fit. I walked kilometres and kilometres and kilometres and in 10, 12 hours, I got 5 signatures. And this was going to take, from now till doomsday to get this done. So it wasn't working. Keep in mind, I'd never done this before. I was trying to find a way to make this work, to help this guy get his 200 names. And he was less successful than I was. I was just energised. This has got to happen. I've got to do it. So next bright idea, I went to nursing homes and said, hey, to the nurse or to the director, whoever I spoke to at the time, I'm helping someone form a political party for seniors' rights, pension rights and so on. We're going to, get into Parliament and do what we can to help. Can we come in and talk to your people and get signatures? Sure, that's wonderful. What a great idea. Well. I would go in and I recall on day one and I was this lovely old lady and I went up and hello, I'm forming a political party and I want to talk to you about signing this piece of paper so we can register and we're going to, help people like you and pension, all, talk about the issues. And she said, oh, you remind me of my grandson. Oh, do I? Yeah. And then began a 1.5 hour long conversation. And she'd sign. Oh, great. The theory worked. I've just got to get the timing down. But I couldn't. Some of these poor people didn't get visitors. And I was the first outside person to talk to them in days, weeks, months. I don't know. So again, I'd finish this time, 8 to 10 hours of talking to old people. And I'd walk away with half a dozen signatures. This is clearly not working. So I just didn't know what to do next. So I came up with this bright idea. Lee Rhiannon will confirm this because she saw me doing this. I went to King Street, Newtown. We're talking 96, 97 era. And I put up a sign that said, stop Pauline Hanson sign here. Join the Seniors Party. And I couldn't beat people off with a stick. Stop Pauline Hanson, I'll sign that. We're forming the Seniors Party. I don't care what you're doing. If it's, I'll sign that. Like, wow. And we got the signatures in a day. And I went back to the guy and said, there you go submit, get registered. Well, that worked. So that led to another party and another party and another party. And this was all happening in King Street, Newtown.
You were just putting the card table out.
Yeah.
Stop Pauline Hanson.
Stop Pauline Hanson.
Vote for the cyclist party. Join the cyclist party.
That wasn't one then. That was later on, and because cycling is an absolute passion of mine, and that we could talk about that later if you want. But by now, this whole theory of mine was dominating my thinking. I said I've had this journey from this card counting exercise, if you will, this intellectual exercise in politics to being about people. Well, back then, no, I was focused. How am I going to beat Vegas? How am I going to do this? And this is going to work. I need to come to the table with lots of political parties from all over the spectrum and send the preferences where I need them to go. Now, my opponents think this is incredibly cynical, or maybe it is, but I was focused on winning, really focused on winning. And I will do whatever I have to do within the law to achieve that. And so we put up the sign, Stop Pauline Hanson, who, by the way, I worked against for 20 years. And if people want to have a look and search that, they'll see. There was a story on the 7:30 report which talks about me doing exactly that, stopping Pauline Hanson for years until they got rid of the group voting ticket and I could no longer stop her. I don't know if you're aware of this, but I'm sorry, I'm diverging now. The Greens, Nick Xenophon, and the Coalition are responsible for the election of 4 One Nation senators in 2016. If the GVT had still been there, she would not have made it. No Pauline Hanson. And all of that devastation she's caused to this country, I had her. And I'd stopped her for years. But I digress. We'll come back to these political parties. So Stop Pauline Hanson, sign here. People were coming in, they were joining the Women's Party, they were joining the Republic Party, the Marijuana Smokers' Rights Party, and on and on and on it went. Until, after many, many, many months of this, people would want to buy, yep, I support you, I've already signed, and I've joined this one and this one and this one. Oh, okay, so I've stopped Pauline Hanson, I've got to come up with another idea. So I put up another sign this next weekend, Stop Fred Nile sign here, who's, personally I get on very well with Fred, but his philosophical view on the world is questionable at the least.
So for the viewers, he was a politician.
Right-wing Christian.
Yeah, right-wing Christian, reverend.
Yes.
And, railed against homosexuality and sin and
yes, drug
reform, pornography, all the rest. But he was very successful in that for a long time.
42 years, mate.
42 years in
42 years in Parliament. Because Fred understood the system. Fred was a political opportunist, an electoral opportunist. Fred knew too well, I only need 2 to 3% to win. So Fred would come out with crazy things like an adjournment speech, an adjournment debate, and talk about Australia adopting blasphemy law. Jesus Christ, we can't have that, right? But that 2 to 3% of people connected, and Fred time and time again would come out with crazy things like that.
But it appealed to a niche.
It wasn't crazy. Fred's a highly intelligent man. I mean, he's getting on now. He must be giving 90 a scare. But the bottom line speaks for itself. Fred understood the electoral system 42 years. Only beaten, I think, by recently Bob Catter, 50 years in Parliament. Billy Hughes, that guy from the North Shore. What's his name? Now was Mayor of Hornsby. Oh, gosh. Ruddock. I think Fred's up there somewhere with that, which is remarkable.
Because in Australia, under our system, you own, like when it comes to upper houses, so the Senate or the Legislative Council, where a state has them, you sometimes only need to get between 1.5% and 2% of the vote with preferences to get elected,
or less. I put the very first guy, Malcolm Jones, on 0.2%, approximately 7,000 primaries. And we achieved the quota of 160,000.
So 7,000 votes out of millions of votes.
Yes.
And the preference, harvesting, whispering,
Harvesting then, whispering later.
Yeah, amalgamation, whatever you want to call it, it then flows through.
Yeah.
And
And Wilson Tucker on 98 primaries 4 years ago in WA.
And the key to that was the political parties, and you've explained about that, setting them up, registering them with the electoral commissions, and then arranging preference deals between the different entities.
Yeah, you've got to get the numbers right.
That's
okay?
right.
It's
Now
really critical.
That is an art, because that surely must have been, like, to mix some metaphors, like herding cats, crabs in a bucket. Everyone wants to be the one who comes out on top.
It's like herding cats that are chasing headless chooks.
Yeah, there you go.
But I had a knack for it. I don't know where this came from. Maybe
surely you must have had to at some point tell people no, or you must have had an idea in your head that, look, I'm going to have to tell this person they're a chance when you know they're no chance.
No.
No?
No. One thing I learned a long time ago, you can't lie. I've been doing this now for decades. Now, have I ever lied to you?
Not that I know of.
No. You can't. You can't, because if you bullshit, no one's going to talk to you again. You can't be in this game for decades and spin shit. You can spin, but you can't lie. So what I would say to you, if you you suggested I might use you up with the intention that you're never going to get elected, what I would say to you is, Jeremy, you're part of a bigger picture. We need you. The chances of you getting elected are remote. I understand if you want to walk away, but we need you for the good of the big picture. Some people walk away, others stay. Having said that, some people have been very upset where they think I coined a disease many years ago called candidates disease. You're probably well aware of that, where people come along, get into the fringe of politics, and they think they're going to be the next, prime minister or premier. They're not, and that upsets some people. And I have had issues with that over the years. But you can't lie to people in this game. You just can't. I know some people do, but I've seen so many people come and go over the years. 25 years, I'm still here.
Because in Australia, we're not taught civics at school. We're taught about our electoral system in the broadest possible terms. The mechanics of it are completely arcane for most people.
They have no idea.
They have absolutely no idea. They hear this term preferences. They really don't know how they work. I think there's some concern in the community. People ask, where are your preferences going and the rest.
Oh, some people think preferences is a dirty word.
They do. But in terms of that dirty word, there's been a move over the last since I think your emergence to get rid of the group voting ticket.
Well,
that was really seen as the thing that was being, by some, rorted or
but
gamed.
ask yourself why. Why do they want to
tell us what the group voting ticket is. Tell us what that is.
Okay. But prior to, I think, was it 83 or 84, the way we voted in the Senate, if people can recall last time they voted.
We're alive.
Sorry?
Or we're alive.
Yeah. The way we voted then was we had to fill out all of the boxes, all of the squares below the line, which meant that there was a very high informal voting rate. So the Hawke government with the AEC wanted a mechanism to make less informal votes achievable. And they came up with the group voting ticket, where you could just vote one above the line, Labor, Liberal, Greens, legalise cannabis, although it didn't exist in those days. And that single one above the line would flow, let's say you voted for a minor party, who was around back then in the 80s, Nuclear Disarmament Party. You voted for the Nuclear Disarmament Party, it would flow down their ticket, probably 2 people, I don't recall, on their ticket. Now, the Nuclear Disarmament Party has had, let me use the words of my detractors, secret backroom deals with faceless men. Okay. Conversations have happened between the Nuclear Disarmament Party and probably then the Democrats or the Greens, Labor Party and so on, where the Nuclear Disarmament Party has agreed that if they fail, everybody that votes one for them, that vote will flow at a full value most of the time. I won't get into the complicated issues where it's not a full vote. It will flow as a full vote to whomever they did a deal with. And that would probably be a party from the left, and it might end up being with, say, Labor's third candidate. So somebody who voted for the Nuclear Disarmament Party might have elected Labor's third. Is that a good explanation of how it works?
Yes, but that's on the basis that the party or whoever controls the party lodges basically a group voting ticket.
You had to.
You had to.
Although there have been situations over the years where parties have not lodged group voting tickets for whatever reason, and that means, and we'll continue with that example of the Nuclear Disarmament Party, if they had not lodged a GVT, a group voting ticket, and you vote one for them and they fall over, then your vote would be exhausted. There's nowhere for it to flow because you have not instructed the AEC where you want that vote to go. So everybody really, unless it's a mistake or it's done for malicious reasons, puts in a GVT.
And that was, I think in the community, that was some of the concern, that the political party, as you put it, instructed where the vote went rather than the system we have now, both in most senates, or most upper houses and the lower house.
That's a furphy.
Well, it's where the voter numbers.
The voter always had control.
Of course, the voter always had a control with their number one.
No, with everything.
Oh, well, they could
vote below the line.
They could vote below the line.
I have always voted below the line. Always. Right from the beginning. I choose where my vote goes.
But now, it's like 0.00001% of the population vote below the line.
But this is an argument.
Because they
this
just
is
get
an argument
in,
by my detractors,
chuck
right?
a one in.
You control it. No, I don't. The voter always controls it. I think the issue here is, I talked earlier about the major parties manipulating the system. Well, of course they have. They have not, prior to getting rid of the GVTs, 2016 at the federal level, 99 in New South Wales, and just recently in Western Australia, the major parties failed to educate the public that you can vote below the line. They didn't want them to, because it was in their favour, to their advantage for people not to. I come along, upset the establishment. Oh my goodness me, we've got to do something about this. And there has been electoral reform, more electoral reform because of me putting ordinary people in parliaments than any other individual in Australia's history. Now, I'm not happy about that. Not happy at all, because what we see after they get rid of the GVT, we come to a system where it's becoming very, very difficult for the mums and dads of this world and people without kids, it's ordinary people to be elected, and that is a really bad thing.
Or single issue parties, like the legalised cannabis parties or others.
I think it's wonderful. It's. I'm going to be a Voltairist now. I'm so happy I can live in a country where we've got parties like One Nation, Cannabis, the Greens, the Shooters, Libertarians, you name it, that can be elected.
Independents.
Independents, of course. Now, I don't have to agree with a lot of these people. And as it happens, I don't. And it's been my right to stop many of them, these extremist cookers that have come out of the COVID movement. I've stopped a lot of them, and I will continue to do so. One Nation worked against them for years.
So that's really interesting.
But I'm glad they exist. I'm glad we have a system where we have a diversity of views and they can be expressed by people getting into Parliament.
So that's really interesting. Your motivation not only was to raise issues, create diversity, get people elected, but it was also to stop other people getting elected.
You bet.
Yeah. So how many people have, you must have
I get asked that question all the time. I really must sit down with a pen and paper and figure it out. Lots. I mean,
dozens.
Oh, yeah, at least. I mean, my best election was Victoria in 18, where I put 9 in one election. 4 in the last Victorian election. You know, I think back of the so-called feral Senate, as Tony Abbott coined it. My fingerprints were on all of those independents, minor parties rather, in the Senate, except Nick Xenophon. Every one of them, in one way or another, owes their seat to things that I did. So how many have there been? I honestly, mate, I don't know. A lot.
Are there any that you're particularly proud of? You like an MP or a senator that you look to and go, look, I think they did good things. They wouldn't have got there without me.
Yes. You know, there's a lot of people that I help that never go public. It's never public. And I think of there's quite a few in the lower house, and I can't mention who this person is because for strategic reasons, privacy reasons, but it's difficult to... No, I can't mention some of these people. But good things have been done. While I think Darren Hinch could have achieved a heck of a lot more, he was quite politically naive. He had a good heart. I think perhaps the biggest thing I've ever been involved in is taking passports off convicted child sex offenders. Now, that was huge. And that'll outlive me. And the amount of young children that we have protected in the third world. Of course, just so your viewers understand, there was a situation where Australian pedophiles would go to places like the Philippines or Thailand or Vietnam, and they could pay as little as $20 and do hideous things to little kids, sometimes babies. And that was a bad thing, a really evil thing. And the legislation that we pushed through in just months stopped that, at least stopped Australians. So that's probably the biggest single thing I've done that I'm very proud of, that I've been a part of. I mean, ultimately, Darren was the senator, but without the work I did behind the scenes, it would never have happened. I'm very proud of that. But there are other so many, small things I touched on about community things, about getting funds to build a shed for a women's soccer team in Geelong. All that community stuff, so much stuff I've forgotten. That's all great stuff. And, while I've people watching this will think that this guy's just some sort of bean counter out there to get people elected. Yeah, that's how it began. But now it's these things that we do, that you do, people like you do when you're in politics, that for the benefit of the community. That's what turns me on now.
What about shockers?
Malcolm Jones was an absolute shocker. The first guy I put in, oh my goodness me. Absolute shocker.
Any other disasters?
Ricky Muir was interesting.
Wasn't he the motoring enthusiast party?
Yeah.
Then didn't he jump to Palmer?
No. I mean, Ricky's a big story. Do you want me to just talk about Ricky in Parliament or how he got there?
Talk about how he got there, because it seemed to a lot of people out there, he was the dog that caught the car. He just put his hand up,
well, a lot of people
got elected. And
some people say it was a fluke. It was an accident. It was an accident it was a fluke from his position, an accident from his position. But I planned the whole thing. And this goes back to, and by the way, the ripples on the pond in politics, this story I'm about to tell you is the reason Fiona Patten was elected in 2014. I could come to that. This is a big story. You ready?
Hit me.
I was in Colorado in 2012. My partner's American, and it was a beautiful summer's day. I remember it like yesterday, and I was checking my emails early in the morning. I was a little bit jet lagged, like 4 a.m. And I'm watching the sun come up. I'm in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. I'm watching the sun come up over the plains, over Denver. A beautiful morning. And there's an email from a guy called Ashley Fenn. Who's that? And the email, I've still got the email. Ashley said, I want to be a senator in 2013. And this might have been at the end of 2011, actually, or no, it was summer. It must have been summer, US summer 11. So that's sort of July, August in 2011. I want to be a senator. I want you involved. Can we talk? And I responded, hey, I'm in the US. When I get back, let's have a chat. So all of that happened. And Ashley said, I'll put you on a monthly retainer. I mean, we're like 18 months out from the election. Like, wow, gosh. I mean, I'd never made a lot of money out of politics, and it wasn't a big monthly retainer. But I want you to teach me about how things work, teach me about preferences, and I'm going to go and do all the deals. I mean, the guy had a massive ego, right? Like, fine. So we were all over the place, and I was teaching him about how it worked, and I don't think he ever truly understood it. I would meet with him in a coffee shop near where he was going to go and have a meeting with, say, Labor or Liberal or someone else. And I'd have to talk about the questions you're going to ask, the terms you've got to use. And then he'd right. How's that go again? Right, okay. And I was like thinking, oh, good grief. Still, he's putting bread and butter on my table. I'll do it. And I recall on one occasion, I think it was the Liberals, and I think we're in Melbourne, he came back and he said, oh, man, I smashed that meeting. Like, oh, good grief. So this went on and on and on. And as we got closer to the election, closer to when the GVT was being lodged, the monthly retainer stopped. So I pick up the phone, and that's all I had to live on at that point. And I really needed that. And I said, hey, mate, your payment's late. Oh, sorry. The dog ate my homework. Nonsense. Right, okay. A week later, still nothing. About 10 days later, I said, listen, mate, can you just, put it through? I really, need this. And, sorry, mate, yeah, I've got a new girl and the check. Check? What check? He'd been transferring it. So we get to the next month. So we're now 2 months late and I'm still working on his campaign. And we get to a point where he basically says, piss off. You don't like it? See you in court. Like, what? He felt that I'd done he didn't need me anymore. So he kicked me out the back door. And I said, well, yeah, we will go to court, mate, but not your court. Okay? And he just dismissed me. And this is how Ricky got elected. Well, first thing I did was I contacted Greg Barnes from WikiLeaks. And I said, listen, Greg, I've got a plan that will elect Julian Assange. It means doing deals with all these groups, including some of the right-wing groups, but it will work. Trust me, we'll get Julian elected. And I really wanted to do that. I think what Julian did was fantastic. I really wanted to put Julian into Parliament. And Greg was on it too. And Greg talks about this in a 7:30 report. And he said he went back to his people to discuss it and came back to me and said, no, we can't do deals. No, we're not running that. And I just said, then it's over. That's really sad. I really wanted Julian to be elected. Imagine sliding doors if Julian Assange had been elected to the Senate in 2013. And a lot of people say what I'm saying, I'm full of shit. Crap. I put Ricky Muir around on 0.5%. Julian pulled over 2%. He would have been elected, mate. His own people sabotaged his campaign. So how did Ricky get elected? I was really pissed off. Firstly, angry at Ashley for reneging on our deal. I really don't like that kind of thing. You shake my hand on a deal, that's it, we got a deal. And then I was a bit flabbergasted at WikiLeaks. So I picked the most innocuous nobody I could find. You seen the movie Being There?
Yep.
Schultze Gardner, is that his name?
Peter Sellers?
Yeah. His character that he played?
Yep.
Yeah. Who can I find? The most innocuous, absolute nobody. Well, it came back to the Motoring Enthusiast Party because they had only just been registered. They had not attended any of my minor party alliance meetings. Nobody knew who they were. So I began dialogue with a guy called Keith Littler and Sharon, his wife. And this is a funny story. I'll get to this in a minute. Keith formed that party so that he could sit in his big V8 car at the traffic lights going brum, 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 and do a big wheelie as he took off. He didn't want anyone telling him, because at the time there was a lot of restrictions on how you could modify your car in Queensland. And he was a big motorhead, big time motorhead.
He just wanted to lace a burnout and not have his car confiscated.
Yeah. I mean, I really didn't care. I wanted to teach Ashley a lesson and show Julian's people you could have had him elected. So I was motivated by frustration, I suppose. So I picked on the Motoring Enthusiast Party, not because I like cars. No, I'm a cyclist, right? I want less cars on the road, more public transport, more bike lanes. It wasn't about that. And I picked on Ricky Muir. Picked on, that's not the right term. I picked Ricky Muir. By this time, 2013, I'd been in the game for a long time. And it's like this. Hey, Jeremy, can you do me a favour, mate? Yeah, what's that? I just want you to, when you do your GVT, if you could just put Ricky Muir before these groups. Oh, yeah, I could do that. Why? Oh, just a favour. You know, I'm playing with a few numbers to see what's going to happen. Now, I had enough people do that, but I wanted to cut it fine. I wanted Ashley to think he could still get there and then snatch it away. Well, I cut it a bit too fine because there were a couple of points in the count where Ricky almost fell over. But nevertheless, I put this thing together and Ricky was elected on 0.5%, smashing Ashley Fenn and showing the people at WikiLeaks, if only you'd listened, Julian would have been a senator. Wouldn't that have been great? Wouldn't that have been amazing? All those years, would he have still gone to jail? Would he have actually constitutionally been able to sit in the Senate? I don't know. But anyway, sliding doors. So now we get to election night. I mean, I knew Ricky was going to make it. I knew. And actually a good friend of mine from the Greens, Luke Edmonds, rang me after the group voting ticket was published, and the conversation began with him laughing his head off. And why on earth did you pick Ricky Muir? He was the only one to pick up on it. Our friend that we mentioned earlier, Kelvin Boneham and Anthony Green and so on, none of those guys had any idea. These people write about stuff after we do things, right? They're not entrepreneurs in the way they think. But none of them picked up on it. Not one. So on election night, I pick up the phone. I mentioned Keith Littler, the Rev head, extreme right-winger, it's a misogynist. The conversation went like this. It's about 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. And I was, hey, Keith. And in the background, I hear, and he's drunk. He says, oh, who's this? I said, it's Glenn. Who? It's Glenn. We've been talking on the phone about preferences and things. Oh, what do you want? And there's someone's revving a car. They're working on a car. I don't know. Driving a car. I don't know. And I said, Ricky's won. He says, what? Ricky's won. I won. I won. No, Ricky's won. Ricky's won. And he says, I hear, shut the f-. Can I swear on this podcast?
Sure can.
Shut the f-. Silence, right? They've turned the car off. And he says, have I won? I've won. I've won. I can't do his drunk, slurred voice, but I said, no, Ricky's won. He said, who? I said, Ricky Muir. Now, understand, Ricky Muir answered a Facebook ad to be a candidate for the Motoring Enthusiast Party because he liked cars. And this happened just weeks ago, so they've never met.
He's forgotten who he is.
Yeah, he's forgotten who you are. He says, who? I said, Ricky Muir. So who's that? I said, your candidate in Victoria. And he said, that little f***, that oxygen thief. I'm like, oh, for God's sake. I said, Ricky's won. He said, are you sure I haven't won? I said, no, Ricky's won. Oh, Jesus Christ, he says. So I could hear him call his wife. Ricky's won. She says, bullshit. So that's how Ricky won.
And he goes into the Senate, into the balance of power.
He does. He does.
And at the time, I think it was timber worker, regional Victoria.
Ricky was the modern version. If we think of pre-industrial revolution Britain, anywhere in the world, I suppose, that mattered for that time, when your typical Englishman didn't go more than 7 miles from where they were born, Ricky was the modern version of that. Ricky never left Victoria. He didn't own a suit. He left school at 14, had his girlfriend pregnant at 16, had spent a huge time of his life unemployed. I think at the time he was an unemployed timber worker from Gippsland. And now he's a senator. And if people want to, see how it began for Ricky, I mean, poor Ricky, oh gosh. Keith Littler had been in touch with Clive, and there was this plan, they called it Plan Z, I think, or Plan X, where Keith and his wife Sharon wanted to destabilise Ricky so much that he gave it up. And then the party could appoint Keith. Now, you may want to get this bit legal, what I'm about to say now. I can't confirm this happened. I strongly suspect this happened. That there was some type of arrangement between Keith and Clive Palmer. I know they'd met a lot. I was part of one of those meetings, part of a lunch here. There was a funny situation where Clive was one side of the Bay Marine, I was the other, and I was trying to get it, and Clive was pulling at the food. I digress.
I bet he won.
I let Clive win. So coming back to Ricky and the beginning, I've just said Ricky was very naive. He'd never left Victoria, and all of a sudden, Clive Palmer's involved. Clive gets him a couple of suits, and they, between Clive and Keith, they organised to fly Ricky to Boston, of all places, to meet with Mike Willesee. Now, if you haven't seen the interview of that absolute disaster interview between Willesee and Ricky Muir, poor Ricky. I mean, he was a kangaroo in the headlights, mate. It was a shocker. Now, I think this whole thing was planned to destabilise Ricky, to have him pull a pin and Keith could become a senator. When Ricky got back to Australia, he asked me to be his chief of staff, which just came totally out of the blue. Well, now my job is to protect Ricky.
You took the job?
Yeah, I did. But my role as chief of staff is I've got to protect him. So I started to talk to him and tell him about Keith and Sharon, their plan to get rid of him. Ricky couldn't believe it. I mean, Rick is very naive. He just couldn't believe it. And he ultimately brought Keith and Sharon on, and which was a massive mistake. He eventually got rid of them. So I was in the office. I brought Pete Breen on. Pete's a barrister, and someone else. And for those first few weeks, we were having, Pete and I, behind the scenes, putting these deals together. I could talk to you about how we saved Arena, how Ricky Muir saved Arena, pulled that out of the whole carbon tax debate, which was a really good thing. The Clean Energy Finance Corp. Clive Palmer takes credit for these things. It was Ricky Muir. And that's just another huge conversation in itself. But I wasn't watching my back.
So that was at the time when Abbott,
yes,
is elected. He's pulling down the carbon tax, and the people who are
and the carbon tax wasn't
pro-climate are trying to save the furniture in terms of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Arena.
Was, see, Clive was all for about saving Clean Energy Finance Corp, right? Well, I don't know. I understand why Clive was doing it, public relations perhaps. But I had Felicity Wade, who was one of my sparring partners in the early days, and we've since become very good friends, talked to me about Peter and I, about Arena, how important Arena was and we had to save it. So Pete and I, right, let's get into Ricky, we'll do this. We're part of the balance of power, we're going to save Arena. So we went to Clive, and Clive went off his nut. We're not saving Arena, not part of Clive's agenda. So I went around to get the numbers.
So why? Just to clarify, why is Clive so important at that point? Because Ricky's elected for the motoring enthusiast
Clive
party.
had 3 senators,
right? And so
part of the balance of power.
Straight away, Ricky was moving that way pretty quick.
Well, Keith Littler was moving that way. Ricky was like a ping pong ball in a rapid, just going with the car. Ricky didn't know anything, mate.
Yep.
He knew nothing. I mean, it later became apparent Ricky had a good heart. He did, but he was, in terms of being a senator, he wasn't great. But he did have a good heart, and I always respect him for that. And he was honest. Clive had his own agenda to save Clean Energy Finance Corp, but Arena wasn't on the table. So I started to do what one does in politics, is go and get the numbers. Someone else I had a hand in putting in Parliament was DLP, what was his name? Madigan. I remember going into his office. I mean, I put the guy there and said, John, we need a favour. I need you to vote for Arena. Now, he hated, or as he put them, windmills. Wind turbines. He hated windmills. And he yelled and screamed and get out of my office. You support windmills. Like, what? So we haven't got him. But I said earlier, not to bullshit, not to lie. And I said to Clive, I've just had a chat with Madigan. I know how he's going to vote, Clive. Do you want to be on the losing team or not? Clive yelled and screamed, and he had Ben Oaquist working with him at the time, which was really weird. I think Ben wanted to save Arena, but he was conflicted perhaps. I'm not really certain. Ultimately, when I stood my ground, Clive folded, and he wanted to usurp the glory of this, and it was his idea. But to get to that point, you know, it was a couple of days of intense stress. And I'll never forget it. Ricky had locked himself in his office. I took his phone. Ricky, put that in the other room. You don't want to deal with this. He's not equipped to deal with this. I had Clive on the line on my phone, and he's yelling and screaming, "Where's that little prick? Where is he? He's left the building, Clive." "No, he hasn't. I want to see that guy." And I'm looking at Ricky, and I'm watching sweat form on his forehead and drip off his nose. And Ricky was farting uncontrollably. Maybe it was a stress thing, I don't know. It stunk in there. I've got Clive. What the hell? This is a scene from another planet. Ricky's like, just fold. I said, no, Ricky, no, we're not. Don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes. Hang in there, Ricky. We'll get this. And we ultimately did. We hung in there. We didn't have the numbers. I let Clive believe we did. This was a really important thing to save Arena. We still have Arena to this day because of Ricky's incredible political nous and strategy.
So ultimately,
we saved Arena.
Clive blinked, voted to retain amendment, and retained the... Yeah, right.
These are the things I talk about these opportunistic ways of winning an election, but then you do things. You do good things for the community, for not just you, but for your grandkids' generation and beyond. And we kept Arena. Well, Ricky saved Arena.
It's interesting you raised Clive Palmer. Have you ever worked with Palmer?
Once.
The United Party...
Only once. I'll never do it again.
United Australia Party have sort of waxed and waned. They've come, they've gone. Like, I think the last federal election, Clive spent $100 million and didn't get someone elected.
He got someone elected.
Did he? Oh, that's right. He got Babet in Victoria. But it was
intellectual giant.
It was a big spend for one Ralph Babet.
On just 4%, mind you.
Just on 4%. When did you work with Palmer? Can you talk about that?
Yes, I can. It was the 2014 Senate rerun in Western Australia when perhaps the best person Clive's ever put in Parliament, Dio Wang. I'm sure everyone's forgotten about Dio now. An honourable young man. I think the first person elected to an Australian Parliament that was born in China. While Lazarus ratted on the party, Jackie Lambie reneged and ratted on the party, Dio stayed loyal. I admire that. Not that he was loyal to Clive, but he was just loyal, and I admire that. So the Western Australian rerun where mysteriously, I think it was 1,200 ballot papers were lost. And there's all sorts of conspiracy theories about it.
And there was a rerun because of the constitutional issue. There was a few senators caught up
and this came
Section
down to
44 of the Constitution.
No Section 44 issue. Oh, was it? I'm not sure. It could be. No, I'm not sure what part of the Constitution.
It wasn't the dual citizenship?
No. That was later. That was 16 era. This was in 2014 was obviously it was post 13 election. I think from memory, 1,200 ballot papers disappeared. And again, from memory, I think it was Luke Edmonds from the Greens, the guy who is one of the few who really understand the numbers, and a mate of mine. I think it was the Greens that brought this to a head. And I could be wrong on that, but nevertheless, it came to a head. There were challenges and a new election was called. Now, for all the conspiracy theories, I know the answer. I know where those 1,200 went. Do you want me now to reveal it for the first time publicly?
Tell everyone.
This is Western Australia. Okay, it's not New South Wales or Victoria or even Queensland. The way those ballot papers were taken from outback WA to Perth, they threw them all in the back of the ute and they made the Kelpie sit on them. Well, the Kelpie moved and 1,200 blew out the back. Now, that's a true story.
So on the basis of the disappearing ballots, you then had to have the whole Senate rerun. And you worked with Clive on the rerun.
I put the preferences together for DO, and I swore halfway through that campaign I could never work with Clive again. Phone calls at 4 a.m, micromanaging.
Pretty hands-on.
Oh, my God. I mean, Clive, as with many billionaires, they like to have yes men and women around them. I'm not that. You engaged me for my understanding of this, let me do it. We had words. Clive, if you want me to do this, let me do this and get out of my face. Well, that was the end between Clive and I. I stood up to him. He didn't like that. And I don't think we've spoken ever since.
It's interesting you talk about billionaires because it's coming up a lot now. There's a sense, certainly in the commentariat, maybe it's in the community, that people don't like billionaires playing in politics. Be it your Simon, your Clive Palmer, or your Climate 200, your Simon Holmes of Court. That there's a sense that if you've got the money and the commitment, then you can really deliver an outcome. And we've seen Labor, although it's stalled, and this is clearly an issue that's front and centre for Senator Payment. They've got donations law reform coming.
Let's look at that though,
which is capping, the expenditure. And
what that's really about is well, I can't talk about private conversations I had with senior members of the government, or even allude to them. It wouldn't be appropriate. But not long after the last election, when we saw all of these so-called teals elected, I mean, there's not a Liberal from Sydney Harbour to Pittwater. They took out not just any seat in Victoria, not just a former Prime Minister's seat, but the founder of the Liberal Party in Kooyong, and another hardcore Liberal seat in WA. So these teals at the last election did very, very well. Now, initially, the Labor Party was really happy about that. I've got to be a little vague about this conversation because it was a private chat between myself and senior members of the government. They really wanted the teals to do well, and they were talking about engaging me in that process in a parliamentary sense. It's hard to find people at a senior level who advisors, chiefs of staff and so on, who really understand how to make things work. And there's not a lot of talent. Now, I'm not going to say there's not a lot of talent in the teals camp. I won't say that. I shouldn't say that, no, because there is some talent. But as this conversation was happening about bringing me in to help the teals maintain their position, to get a lot of wins so that they get re-elected, I mean, there's an advantage in this for the Labor Party, right? The teals win, Liberals lose. A decision was taken at a very senior level in the Labor Party, in the government. No, we're going to do the opposite. And the first thing Albanese did, was took staff off the teals. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
We don't want the teals to do well at all because they've come for the Libs. What if they come for us next? Now, this whole narrative of this
That's really interesting because you do see ostensibly what are Labor seats, potentially Labor seats, like inner Sydney. Someone like Alex Greenwich, independent member for the seat of Sydney.
Yeah.
He's ostensibly a teal, very sort of teal.
Before the teals were invented.
Yeah, before the teals were invented. That's probably...
Fiona Patton is a teal before the teals were invented.
Yeah, probably a seat that Labor would win. And if you look at a seat like Tanya Plibersek's seat or Albo's seat, maybe they are ripe for a...
Well, this was a position taken by somebody in the Labor Party, in the government at the time, about 3 years ago, just after the last election. The talk of me coming on board in the parliament to help the Teals progress was over, was done. No, I've since joined the dots and had further conversations now, years on, a couple of years on. Labor's taken the counter view. They want the Teals to fail.
Sorry, just on that, were you considering working with the Teals at some point?
Yes.
Right.
As a sort of the super staff. This was something the government was talking about. Mm-hmm. How can we... The conversation was happening. What infrastructure can we put in place to help the Teals do well?
Yep.
And I said they've got to cut as many ribbons as possible in their electorates. You know, understand what I'm saying? They've got to be seen to be winning things on the ground for their electorates. Now, most of the Teals are big picture, save the world type people. Well, that's great. That's wonderful. But throughout this conversation, we've been talking about the importance of helping people. Now, I dare say somebody in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, on the North Shore of Sydney, you know, do they need new schools? Do they need a new bridge built? Do they, not like country people, but they do need things. They really do. And what have we seen? What have we seen from these Teals? What have they done? Nothing. In their electorates. Nothing. And this is a deliberate decision made by this government to harm the Teals. This narrative of this conversation has been about the major parties coming together to stop people like you and independents and minor parties, because you're a nuisance to the government. You know that very well. They don't want you there. They'd rather see a Liberal there or a Nat. Or if it's on the other side, they'd rather see Labor. And someone said to me a long, long time ago, don't ask me to talk about what I can do or what they can do, but look at what they do. And what they do is constantly change the rules, harass, coerce, bully, whatever, to keep people like you and other independents out of the parliament. And I've seen that firsthand.
And you think they're applying
absolutely
that to in their attitude to the Teals?
Well, yeah, the bottom line speaks for itself. What does Albanese do? The first act, take staff off them.
Which seems like a pretty crazy brave strategy to lock in that two-party hegemony, that duopoly, when you look at the federal election we're now facing, where the money is on a hung parliament. With
yes,
Teals,
indeed. Now, this
Teals
might
and
come
independents.
This could come back to bite.
What does Dutton need to win the election? 21 seats? How many Teals are there? 9?
There's 6 so-called Teals, isn't there?
Teals.
I think 6 Teals. Or was there 7? Gosh, the numbers guy. I've lost the numbers. But there are others like Helen Hayes in Indi.
Andrew Wilkie.
Andrew Wilkie, of course. Bob Catter. Interesting character.
You ever worked for Bob?
No. I've worked with him, of course, because he's there.
Yep.
And I've had really interesting conversations with Bob over the years. And when people ask me, well, what's Bob Catter like? I think he's a great member for where he's at, in Northern Queensland. He wouldn't work many other places.
No.
But Bob is a very interesting character, and Bob is the only man I've ever met that has the ability to interrupt himself. At a personal level, I like Bob.
Yeah.
And he's come out with some very funny things over the years, and I think of what he said in regards to the same-sex marriage debate. Do you remember that?
I remember some of it. I remember the word proclivities.
Well, he's got lots of interesting words. But he said words to the effect of, while we're all concerned about this same-sex marriage debate, 3 Queenslanders have been eaten by crocodiles.
I do remember. I've seen that one. That's a classic. But we've got a federal parliament where there's a growing cohort of Teals or independents.
Yes.
They seem very hard to remove. Once people start voting independent, they seem to
I think a good example of that, we're going to see that, is Di Lee.
Yep.
A very good friend of mine. I've known Di since 2008. And what a wonderful community independent.
That was a real disaster for Labor out in Western Sydney, wasn't it?
Now that was part of Labor's thinking. Goodness me, Teals, they do well. People in seats Labor seats, see how well they're doing. Look at Daly. No, we've got to do all we can to stop them. We would rather see the Liberals take these seats back than we face danger. That's what they've done. This narrative, this conversation, the major parties have been rigging the system to suit themselves for over 100 years. They're still doing it, mate. They're still doing it. What's wrong with diversity? What's wrong with independence? What's wrong with minor parties? Nothing. It's good for the community.
But surely there must be a balance between, I mean, the Liberal Party, massive amounts of corporate donations. The Labor Party gets a lot of money from their affiliated unions. So they really look to be capping the amount that independents can and other parties can raise.
Sure.
And lock in their I suppose, inherited advantage that they've got these revenue streams. They've got a big war chest because a lot of the political parties, established political parties like Labor, Green, Nationals, Liberals, have a big bank. Like they've got bank accounts. They've got money in the bank that they millions that they can. They don't really have to go and raise more money.
Yeah.
They can just cycle that money around through public funding. Independents have to go and create that money, or minor parties have to go out and shake the tin. And
Mate, it's tough. It's really hard,
and it's an expensive business.
It can be. Yeah, it can be very expensive. I've always had to run smart campaigns because I've never had a lot of money in campaigns. But you're right. All of these so-called reforms, and I'm always very sceptical when I hear someone from a major party talk about electoral reform. What are they really saying? Let's continue to rig the rules to keep minor parties and independents out. We keep it an old boys, old girls club. Coles and Woolies at either end of town, we don't want any independent operators here. Well, to hell with you.
It's not a surprising story, but one that probably doesn't benefit the people of Australia or any state. Now, it's a particularly pertinent because you're in a new role. You're now working with Senator Fatima Payman. That was a really it captured the nation's attention.
Yes.
Fatima Payman walking away from the Labor Party, a newly elected young Muslim woman from Western Australia, and on the back of Labor's approach, her difficulty with Labor's approach to the war in Gaza.
Yeah.
How did you come to be working with Senator Payman?
Much has been written and speculated. I'll give you the story here. I had been asked by some community people in southwest Sydney. This is prior to Senator Payman, prior to meeting Senator Payman, many weeks before, to come out into southwest Sydney and to talk to them about elections and how they worked.
And this is after October the 7th. This is October 7, 2023.
Oh, yes, well after that. So I'd been asked to do that, as I've been asked by all sorts of groups over the years to talk about elections, even a Jewish group at one time, but all kinds of groups. So I went out there in my capacity as someone who understands this to help potential independents win seats. There were a couple of meetings, I think 2 meetings before I met Fatima. And the conversation was just about the mechanism of elections. Of course, I'm in a room full of people. I mentioned earlier about candidates disease. They've all got it. Mate. We're going to win all these seats. We're going to win this. We're going to win that. And I had to explain to them, well, no, let's focus on 1 or 2. No, we're going to win 20 seats. Like, I've had it all before, mate. Whoever the groups are, they're all going to win 20 seats. So that aside, coming to how Senator Payman and I met, I received a phone call from one of these people in southwest Sydney and said, Senator Payman would like to meet you. Oh, okay. Would you do it? And I said, yeah, sure. Well, I had to get off and Google, who's Senator Payman? I didn't know who she was. I knew by reputation who she was because while I hadn't focused on her name, I'd focused on how she was elected. And she was the 3rd Labor person elected in Western Australia at the last election. Of course, the Green was elected. So for four progressives from Labor, four progressives rather, to be elected in WA is, pretty unusual. And that came off the back of the COVID election with McGowan and how things, he did very well there. The state election, we won't go down that path. That's another story in itself. But she was elected, nevertheless. And she was never expected to be elected. She was just token diversity. A term I gave her and she used in a speech, by the way. Token diversity. Labor are very good at token diversity. You've probably seen it. They'll get all sorts of ethnic groups involved to bring votes in. I mean, like they're playing their electoral game. So she was token diversity, the first hijab-wearing Muslim to be elected, by the way. Now, she was never meant to be elected from Labor's position. It was a bonus, I suppose, from them at the time, but not later. So I met Fatima and her husband, Jacob, in a home in southwest Sydney about a week to 10 days before she crossed the floor. I didn't know a lot about her. In fact, I had to Google while I was in the car before I walked in what she looked like. And I went in and she had a big smile on her face, as her husband did, and I didn't understand about you don't touch a Muslim woman. We shake hands, and that's a big no-no. I didn't get that at the time. And the room was full of men, community leaders from southwest Sydney, and Senator Payman. And I was a little bit concerned as to where this conversation was going. They was effectively telling her what to do. I was invited to the meeting, so I just sat there, and then the conversation got around to what she was doing. That there was a motion coming up from the Greens to do with Palestine, and she had to support it. Okay. And I said to her, you understand what will happen if you cross the floor? She sort of said, yeah. And I said, well, I didn't think she did. I said, for starters, you'll be the first in decades to do this. Ratting on the Labor Party is a supreme sin. You could break the law. You could be a drug dealer. I think of a notable senior member of the Labor Party whose husband was a drug dealer. You could steal cars. You could do all sorts of things. They'll forgive you. But you rat on the party? No. You're going to purgatory. You're going to Labor Party hell forever. You will lose pre-selection. I mean, you've probably already lost it now because of your stance on various issues. And she was sort of like, I'll exaggerate now, but she was like, oh my. I was calling it as it was. If you do this, this is what's going to happen. You're done in the Labor Party. They will probably treat you accordingly to maintain your vote, but your time in this parliament is limited until the election after next, and then you're done. Your career's over. So that was the tone of the conversation. But I had to say more to her privately. So when the meeting had ended, I said, Senator, there's not many people, not many politicians I've met who truly have the strength of their convictions. And you're one of them. And I admire that. I really admire that. If you can act on your conscience, if you're prepared to die on the beaches for something you believe in, I will help you if you want my help. And that's how she later asked me to be a chief of staff. And I said, yeah, absolutely, I'll do that. It's not necessarily about the issue, although it's a very important issue. It's about her and her ability to stand for what she believes in. She's prepared to die on the beaches for her beliefs. And I really admire that. There's not many politicians I've seen or worked with or had things to do with over the years, over 25 years now, that have her spine, have her background, her backbone.
And so that was as an experienced political operator, if I can call you that, to encourage her to, to follow, have the courage of her convictions, that you would you would join her in that journey?
I didn't need to encourage her to follow her convictions. She's got that already.
She had it, but
she's got it, mate.
But you were saying you could be a key ally as an advisor, someone who understood what it meant to be outside the major party system, but also in terms of navigating the path towards a new political party. And you've registered...
well, the first step was to navigate this Machiavelli bear pit that is the parliament. And I come back to what we touched on earlier. What is the role? What is a good senator? What does a good member of an upper house look like? I think there are varying views on that. Some would say, oh, you've got to toe the party line. Phooey. I don't believe in that. You've got to vote on your conscience. That's pretty arrogant. I mean, Madigan voted on his conscience and he didn't achieve anything. Or you're there to serve the people. Yeah, tick that box. What does serve the people mean? Does it mean vote for what you believe is right or wrong, or does it mean go in and bat for people? I take the latter. And I said that to Fatima. I said, if you're going to be part of the crossbench, you are in a position to go and get a school built in this little town. Get a community hall. Get councillors up in the bush to help farmers who are topping themselves because things aren't working out. These are things I've been involved in over the years. And I talked to her about this. And it really flicked a switch. And she said, I'm on it. Yep, let's do it. And the very first meeting I had with the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, and I've negotiated with many, many PMOs over the years. And I said to them, this is the current PMO, a transactional relationship. You will need our vote. And if you do, I talked about that figurative boat ramp in Esperance, you know. The more school teachers, the more MRI machines we need in remote area hospitals, whatever, in Western Australia. We want to do things for the people of Western Australia. If you want the Senators' vote, we need to talk. And they figuratively folded their arms and said, we don't operate that way. You don't? How do you operate? Well, you'll just vote for us when you need it. I say, have you heard of the word abstain? I don't operate that way. I'm very transactional. And that's how you help people to get things done. I'm not going to be and nor is Senator Payman for that matter, a stooge of any government. No, we're there for the people. So the relationship broke down with this Prime Minister's office before it had even begun, and the Prime Minister has refused, talking about staff being taken away, has refused to give us our full staff allocation. Jackie Lambie has 3 more staff than us. Pocock 2. Hanson 2 or 3. All of the Teals have more staff. We struggle, mate. I mean, the amount of legislation that right, what comes up in the upper house of New South Wales, the Senate is dramatically busier. The amount of ledge that comes across our desk, we struggle.
Are they doing that on the basis they don't recognise her as an independent? Or
yeah, well, Albo has taken this whole thing, I think, personally, and I've known Anthony for many years before he went into the place. I mean, he was an operative in Sussex Street, a mentor of Luke Foley, a friend of mine. I think you know Luke well, don't you? Yeah.
I do.
A pity he never became Premier, apart from, I think he would have been good. But anyway, that's another story too. I think the Prime Minister has taken this almost personally. He said in a media interview, the Labor Party is a collective. We're a collective. Now, this is almost Victorian style thinking. Fatima had an opinion and dared to cross the floor. Well, this is a cardinal sin for this old school Prime Minister who up until recently referred to the coalition as the Tories. You know, he's from another era in that respect. So he's punishing her. We don't have our staff allocation. And, you know, that makes it easy when they come to us for their vote. I'm sorry, we haven't been able to get across that legislation. No, if you want to tango, we'll tango, mate.
And Senator Payman's there for a while too. She's only been elected.
She's there for another 3 years.
Another 3 years.
I think the numbers might change.
At the moment, the government needs their votes.
They need the Greens plus 3.
Plus 3. So they can shop around a bit. They've got Pocock, Lambie.
Pocock falls over most of the time. Lambie, she's all over the shop, but...
And there's another independent, a former Jackie Lambie Network senator.
Yes, so they can...
Lydia Thorpe.
Lydia, yes. Though, you know, Lydia's an interesting one. A lot of people perceive Lydia as unhinged. I get on very well with Lydia at a personal level. And I think there's some real scope there. If Lydia is clever, I think that she could be that Fred Nile on the other side of politics. I really do. I mean, she's unconventional, for one. I don't think I'd have the courage to go in and talk to our king, King Charles, our great monarch, the way she did. But I certainly admire her stance. And she's great.
Yeah, she's certainly polarising, but she's
incredibly polarising.
But in politics, sometimes that's all you need, and she can get a headline. I mean, you know, getting global headlines.
You ought to see the stand-up, almost punch-ups between her and Jackie Lambie. It's funny.
So you're working with Fatima Payman, Senator Fatima Payman, on, you know, navigating this way potentially out of the Labor Party, or, you know, eyes wide open about what this actually means. But at the same time, there's a pretty powerful block that Labor's paying attention to of community leaders who are very worried about Labor's stance on Gaza and are organising. They're talking to you, and that's turned into two vehicles that I'm aware of, which is like Muslim Vote, and which I don't know where that's up to.
Muslim Votes matters. There's lots of names bandied around, but
has that actually turned into a political party? Muslim Vote,
no.
But Senator Payman has registered Australia's Voice.
Correct.
Okay, so tell us about that, Australia's Voice. Because as my understanding is, as an elected senator, she doesn't need to go through all the rigmarole of collecting signatures to register as a standing senator. She can create her own political party.
Correct.
It's just a tick a box exercise.
Correct, and she's not the only one. Others have formed political parties with the stroke of a pen.
Well, my understanding is that Palmer's party has been deregistered. It's been a disaster.
You know, I talked earlier
but
about
it may be re-registered.
Lack of talent in there, in that place. You know, why on earth they let it go, and now it's too late.
Is it?
Yes.
Can't Senator Babbitt register a political party?
But he's run out of time, mate.
Has he, before the federal election?
Yeah, I mean, there's a procedure. It's now 1,500 names. If you come to me and say, I want to form a federal political party, you need to collect 1,500 names, or any of your viewers, 1,500 names. Now, that in itself could take a year.
Yeah.
If you're good, you might do it in a few months. If you're a sitting member of the federal parliament, a senator or in the lower house, the stroke of a pen, you can form a party. Now, Clive has always used people for that. I think back of Brian Burston. He used him to form a political party. Craig Kelly. And now he's got Senator Ralph Babbitt. Why on earth they let the registration go is beyond me. Because if you let it go, it means you can't use that name again until there's an election under your belt. They can't use the name that they had at the last election. My thinking was, Clive's finished. He doesn't want to do this anymore. He's got the best train set, you know, in the street at Christmas. You always had a rich kid in your street, right, who had a better train set than you. Clive's got the biggest and best train set.
Building the Titanic?
Yes. I can tell you a funny story about that too. So many stories over the years. Clive is sick of this train set, sick of Parliament. This is what I thought. And he's just let it go. Well, now here we are, potentially weeks, maybe a few months out from the election. I said it's too late. It's too late in an administrative sense that if you were a federal member of parliament and you came to me today and said, I'm going to form a party, I said, well, you can, but you're going to run out of time. You might get your paperwork in tomorrow, but the AEC need weeks, a month or so to process that. This is just standard. Then they advertise it for a month. Then there's objections that come in. They've got to be assessed. This whole process is about 3 to 4 months. It's too late.
It's too late.
It's too late.
That's pretty interesting. This is the first time in a long time that there's not going to be Palmer.
Since 13.
Palmer on the ballot. Opens things up for those.
What he could do, if he found another minor party, I'm speculating now. Well, let's pick on someone else. It's not Clive, Fred Smith, who's a billionaire. Goes up to you and you've got a party registered, the Angry Aussies Party. Hey, listen, mate, you've never done any good at this, never done very well. I know a billionaire who's got millions of dollars who's prepared to throw it at this. You can run somewhere. We'll fund the campaign if we can have your party. Now, there's still time, if he did this now, to change the name.
Just change the name. Okay.
He won't get the name he had last time, but he might get something else.
He can't call it United Australia Party, but he can call it...
Could he call it the Uniting Australia Party or the United Party of Australia?
Maybe.
These are the details you'd have to check with the AEC. But there are pathways forward, and for all I know, he might already be doing this. I don't know. But Clive's a funny character in that you may be aware he's trying to register the name or copyright, I think, is that the term? The name Teals?
Yeah, he's trying to basically take the IP of the Teals and...
But it's what happens in the corporate or the legal world is very different to what happens in the political or electoral world. Sometimes think it's all about Clive just generating media. I tell you what, if you're a Silk or something and you were made of Clive's, you'd be doing all right. But Clive doesn't care. He spends millions and millions of dollars going to the highest court in the land. He doesn't care. Keeps life interesting and entertaining.
So we've got Palmer. Looks like the wheels are coming off a bit there. Haven't done their homework. But you've done your homework with Australia's Voice.
Yes. I guess your question is, are we going to win seats? Is that your question?
Well, are you running in lots of seats? The $1 million question is, Glenn, where are you running?
The plan is to run in all Senate seats, possibly excluding the Northern Territory, probably, and selected lower house seats. The problem we've got, not just the problem that Fatima's party's got, is the same problem that Cannabis has got, same problem the Shooters and other small parties have got, in that just months ago, the coalition was polling very badly. They're now polling pretty good. And the last time I saw a poll in Victoria, and Victoria is a great example because Babet was elected, they're polling 4 points higher than at the last election. And what does that mean? Babet was elected on 4%, roughly. We're talking round figures now. He beat the third Liberal to the post. And the third Liberal, look, from memory, was somewhere between 3.5% and 3.8%. I don't recall the exact number. Just forget about preference flows for the moment. So in simple terms, Babet's on 4% and the Libs are just under 4%. Babet wins. That's how he won, on 4%, with the quota at 14.29%. He wins on just 4%. So the conversation I was having months ago is possible, very probable, that a minor party can win in every state. And I know Cannabis are running Fiona Patton in Victoria. Whether it's Cannabis or whether it's Australia's Voice or one of a dozen other minor parties, my advice would be the same. It's going to be tough now because the coalition is doing this in the polls. This. What we need for minor parties to win is for the coalition to pull what they did at the last election or less. And if that happens, then, yeah, we could see 3 to 6 minor parties potentially win around the country. Some people say, and I don't accept this argument, that the Labor Party is going to do so badly that there could be seats for sale. It could be seats available from the progressive side. I don't believe so. For that to happen, Labor would have to really, really be on the nose. I mean, in historical terms, it would be unprecedented for Labor just to win one seat, because the Greens will probably win a seat everywhere in the country, in the states, that is, probably, highly likely. If we go back to the 2019 election, Labor only won one seat in the Senate. Some in Labor...
One extra seat, did you mention?
No. In 2019, Labor won one seat in the Senate. And the others were won between the Greens, LNP and One Nation.
Yep.
I'm not convinced we're going to go back to that. I mean, we might. Look, well, I won't identify who's telling me this, but some of my friends in Labor are saying we're very worried about Queensland. We're really worried about Katie Gallagher, interestingly, in the ACT. Like, wow, really? That came out of left field. Some in the Labor Party think there's a chance that Pocock and a Liberal could win in the ACT. Like, whoa, that'd be unprecedented. They're also worried about their last candidate in Tasmania. So I think Labor's danger is possibly Queensland. They think, this is what they think, Tasmania and the ACT. So coming back to minor parties, I don't believe, if they're going to win, I don't think they're going to take a seat off the left. If they're going to win, I think they're going to take a seat off the right. Although there's a question mark over what Labor thinks could happen in the ACT and Tasmania. So is it possible for minor parties? Is it possible for Fatima to win, for Fiona in Victoria to win? I think that depends on whether Liberal closes the door. Now, if Liberal close that door, if Liberal pick up a few percentage points, you ever play the game when you're a kid or at a kid's birthday party, musical chairs, where there's one chair available? There may not be a chair available.
One of the key things in running a effective Senate campaign is to have lower house seats.
Yes.
Running as well.
Yes.
To raise the profile.
For a couple of reasons.
For a couple of reasons. We'll talk to those reasons and how are you travelling, Australia's Voice travelling with those? Because with candidates comes risk management, because you've got to manage what people are saying it, where they're saying it, and with Australia's Voice you might have candidates running up against some of the most senior members of the government and in fact, cabinet, people like Tony Burke. So there's going to be...
That's not likely. And let me clarify right now. Senator Payman has nothing to do with so-called Muslim votes or Muslim votes matters. There's nothing to do with us.
Yep.
Whatsoever. Have we talked to them? Of course. But we talked to the Liberals. We talked to the Nats. We talked to Jackie Lambie. We talked to everybody. But there's no formal relationship there. So whatever happens in southwest Sydney, they are community independents. They're not part of Australia's Voice.
Yep.
So coming back to a question, why do you run in the lower house? A couple of reasons. It's a very economical way to show the public that you're a political entity.
You exist. You're on the ballot.
You're on the ballot, right? But it's also problematic in that you raise the issue of rogue candidates. And I think of a classic one from the Liberal Democrats who, as you know, were a libertarian-based party. They now changed their name. But I go back to, which election was it? So many elections. It's all a blur. This libertarian fellow, talking about candidates getting out of control, he was not experienced in the media. And the journalist asked him a question about, sexuality, and you can do whatever you want. You want to be gay, that's fine. You are gay, that's fine. You want to have sex with frogs, I don't care. Words to that effect. I don't remember exactly what he said, but the thing I do recall, he said, incest should be legal between consenting adults.
Oh, wow.
Oh, my. Oh, dear. Now, you mentioned candidates saying potentially, yeah, I think of that one.
Wild.
So let me just finish that point, though, on the importance of lower house seats. It raises the profile. But from my perspective, I've always said, if you were to come to me, I want a hand to get elected in the upper house. We're going to run in these key marginal seats and we will use that as leverage to get you preferences. That's what it's about for me. We're not going to win those lower house seats, but it is leverage to help you win in the upper house.
Speaking of leverage, Gina Rinehart's got a lot. She's got a finger on the
lots of zeros.
Lots of zeros. She's got a pretty healthy pulse, like a fiscal pulse there, and it has been reported that she's been spotted, Phuket, Koh Phangan, somewhere in Thailand,
with her good friend Pauline Hanson.
Pauline, what's your take? Do you reckon Gina's going to dump a load of cash into One Nation? I mean, One Nation.
She has. She's backing Pauline's legal fight. She's got a mate in Pauline Hanson. Pauline, she's an interesting character.
It just one of the interesting things, and I'm going to explore this more on the podcast, is there's a tension in the right of Australian politics, and I think globally, and that is there's these populist, dare I say, nationalist parties that pop up with a racial inference that immigration isn't.
There haven't been many immigration-based parties. I think of Australians Against Further Immigration.
Well, there's one.
That was back in the 90s.
Sustainable Australia. They're like low population, but I think that there's a bit of a tension.
I don't know. Sustainable. I think they're just against immigration in general rather than picking on a particular group.
Yeah, that's right. But regardless of the particular group, that there's elements in the conservative side of politics who are saying immigration's bad, it's a problem, we've got too many immigrants coming in, it's putting pressure on infrastructure, housing demand, all of these things.
It is putting pressure on infrastructure at the moment. While we have been a pro-immigration country from the beginning, and I think immigration has been wonderful for Australia. And I think this morning when I arrived and you were downstairs getting a coffee, we got some of the best coffee in the world. Thanks to what? Immigrants. And it doesn't end at coffee, mate. It's everywhere. This beautiful example of this so-called melting pot. It's great. I love it. I just love it. I love it. I love it when Greeks can come here. When I was a child, they were Greeks and Italians. They're just wogs, right? That's what people said. Then they make the mainstream. We've got, I think of when Dipio Domenico became a famous football player. That's when they've made it, and they've, I love what immigration's done to this country. Well, I think it's wonderful.
Well, there's no doubt that there's just massively improved the cultural milieu in Australia, having all these people.
Could you imagine if Pauline Hanson or someone of her ilk had the balance of power in 1947-48? There would be no displaced persons brought to Australia. We'd be white. We'd be English, Scottish, Irish, and goodness knows whatever else they could find. There'd be no Italians, there'd be no Greeks, there'd be no Yugoslavs, no Dutch, no everything, because Pauline wouldn't have had it if she had been around back then. And you'd find yourself in the supermarket today, and the most exotic food you could find would be Kraft cheese.
I know, but there's that cultural element. But when you see Gina Rinehart, whose businesses, they demand skills, labour, that we're not creating ourselves in terms of we've got a low fertility rate, low populate, we're not having the kids. Our population is actually being maintained and growing on the basis of immigration.
Oh, well, it always has been.
It always has been. The same thing in the States, the same thing in the EU. Low fertility rates, immigrants coming in, a lot of them with skills that are essential to the economy. It's a funny thing to have Gina Rinehart's, whose businesses, who's probably very pro-business, wants to see a thriving Australian economy, sitting down with someone, and that depends on pretty healthy immigration rates, sitting down with someone who would probably dial that right back or use it as at least as a political football.
I've just said I'm pro-immigration, and I am. But are the numbers a little bit out of control at the moment for our infrastructure? Are they? I mean, we brought in, was it 600,000 last year?
It was 550, something like that.
Okay, that might be a bit much for our infrastructure at the moment. It might be. Don't get me wrong. I think immigration is great for this country on so many levels. But we're seeing housing affordability. It's not just immigration that's caused that. That's part of the problem. The real problem is negative gearing. In allowing a system where housing is about investment and making money when it should be about people. That's the real problem. And while Bill Shorten had a crack at, well, we should maybe get rid of it, the coalition just jumped on it, mate. Now, getting rid of negative gearing is one of these hot potato things. We need a very strong leader that can get up and say, okay, we're capping negative gearing. If you want to buy an investment property or two, and maybe we need to talk to an economist to see what's the appropriate level. But you're not going to have 10 and use it as a mechanism to avoid tax, because all that's doing is when a young couple, or anybody for that matter, goes to buy a home, they're competing against investors who are backed by enormous wealth most of the time compared to them. And negative gearing has contributed more toward this crazy, out of control spiral of property prices than anything else. It needs to be fixed. It really needs to be fixed.
Oh, look, like you've got me there, but it's after Bill's collapse on that and franking credits and the way the Liberals are talking about it, I think it's going to be a long time before we see anything done about it, sadly.
We need a leader with courage, mate. Prepared to make the hard decisions, the right decisions. Not just now. I mean, 3-year terms. Governments get in for the first 18 months, they're so-called reformists doing what they want, and then they're concerned about the next election. And effectively the last, they'll coast for 6 months and then the last year is all about campaigning.
What's your view on fixed terms?
Absolutely. 4 years?
4 years, fixed term.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. It gives governments of either colour time to do what they need to do. And if we don't like them, vote them out. But they're not governments of expediency. Well, of course, they probably still will be, but less so. You've got fixed 4-year terms in state parliaments around the country, in Victoria, New South Wales, WA, just as some examples.
The US. Look, it's pretty crazy. I just wanted to raise with you, like, what's your take on the US election? It just seems like crazy to me that the US election with the primaries and then the election itself, it's just a perpetual election. It
Yes.
seems like there's about, well, literally there's about 18 months where you've got a president, an administration governing, but with this, with the staggering of the Congress and
look, this is just
it's just perpetual elections.
You may
isn't
or may not be aware my partner's American, so I spend a lot of time in the US. I have family over there.
Colorado, don't you?
Yes, well, most of the people now in Illinois. I was there at Christmas, and the Midwest is an interesting place at Christmas. But the US electoral system, yeah, it's look, the US is a corporatized version of democracy. And these are not my words. These were raised by Melissa, my partner's nephew, very smart young man, 21, 22 years old, at university. And he just came out and said it at the dinner table. We're owned in this country. Like, what? What do you mean? He said, we go through school, we go to university, we get a debt that we carry till our 40s. We need to get a job straight away if we want healthcare. No Medicare in the US, mate. You get it, for those of your viewers who don't know it, if you don't have an employer to pay your insurance, as they call it, then you're in deep trouble. 2 years annual leave, 2 weeks annual leave. less public holidays than us. They're owned in America.
No
Almost.
real minimum wage.
That's changing. That's changing. It's not a good place if you are a working person or middle class. If you're wealthy, it's a great place. Or if you're a corporation, wonderful place. The tide started to turn in America with Ronald Reagan, who shifted the tax burden from corporates to middle America and working America. And we've seen successive governments continue to do that. And now Trump will take that even further. And ironically, the very people that voted for Trump, those white angry men, Trump's policies will impact them in a negative way the most. It's a scary place. I don't like America as a society. I think it's a dangerous society. I mean, I've met lots of wonderful Americans. Their foreign policy around the world, oh my God. Interventions everywhere. I think of what they did in Chile. I think of what they did in Iran. The first little exercise of the CIA outside their borders was to get rid of a democratically elected government of Iran back in the 50s. Did you know that? And they installed the Shah. And then Americans wondered why 20 years later there was this rebellion and they took captives, hostages from the US embassy. And it spun in America like, oh, look how evil these Satanist people are. Hello, look at what you are doing with your foreign policy around the world. Think, guys. Just think. And they're so overt about it.
They are. Well, we've got Donald Trump saying they're going to take Greenland, the Panama Canal. Greenland, like, is Greenland a country? I thought it was like the Danes owned it.
I think it's like a protectorate.
I think it's a Danish
Denmark.
Yeah.
But they are. My understanding is that there is a movement to make it an independent country.
There must be some oil or gas up there or something that they're eyeing off strategically. Could be important. Now, look, before you go, we've been talking for a while, and it's interesting that you raise corporations in the US. People in the legalised cannabis movement would know this, and people who are following cannabis would know this, that the cannabis issue in America has gone from a sort of grassroots justice movement into a multi-billion-dollar economic powerhouse.
Oh, yes, I've seen that. I've seen that in Colorado.
And there's a lot of concern that in Australia that we don't want to see that massive corporate model take over medicinal cannabis and
rightly so.
Probably adult recreational cannabis in Australia, to the point now where there's big lobby groups, big money. It's worth about $35 billion a year. But interestingly, you were in Colorado when Colorado, I think they were the first or second state.
Colorado and Washington, I believe, did it at the same time.
They had a
some years
citizens'
ago.
referendum.
Yeah.
And in the early 2000s, I think, legalised it.
No, later than that. It was
2012, 2013.
I said to you earlier before we started recording, I have a photo. Melissa and I, this was a day or two after it was legalised, we went up to, one of the towns. I forget the name of the town.
You too stoned?
No. I wanted to go into a dispensary to have a look. I was really curious. Like last week it's illegal, this week it's legal. And when I went in there, my first impression, and I'd been fortunate enough to do a lot of backpacking in Warsaw Pact countries before the wall came down. It was a really interesting time to be there. And I happened to be in Germany when the wall came down. It was just fantastic. I digress again. But my first reaction when I went into this dispensary, it looked like a pharmacy from somewhere in Budapest or Prague in the late 80s. This guy was wearing this white gown and had a white thing on his head, little hat on his head. wow, this is really, really weird. And I had a conversation. I'll dig out those photos and I'll give them to you if you want to display them. I'm very happy for you to do so.
I'd love that.
I told him I'm from Australia. I work in politics. We are grappling with issues of legalising cannabis at all sorts of levels in Australia. I think we're going back to, was this around, when did they do this? 2013, 14 era?
Yeah, I think so, 13, 14.
And you've just made it legal now in this state. And this was a young guy. He described himself as a gunjapreneur. I'm a gunjapreneur. You know, last week he was whatever he was doing last week, and now I'm going to make millions. And I said, look, I'm interested. Talk to me about what you're doing. And then he did. We had a lovely conversation. And I said, do you mind if I get a photo together? And he said, yeah, hang on a tick. And he went out the back and he came out with pounds. So I call it pounds or kilos? Pounds of cannabis. And I loaded myself up and got a photo. So I'll dig that photo out.
Well, it's interesting because from that time when Washington, Colorado voted, I think it's now 38 states have effectively done the same thing. California, New York.
Yeah.
Recently, there was a plebiscite in Florida at their federal election that narrowly lost. They had to get 65 or 60% of the vote. Fell a couple of percentage short.
Look, it'll ultimately be legal everywhere in the US.
Well, there's a big push to make it federal legally. And interestingly, both Harris and Trump ran on a cannabis legalisation platform.
And rightly so.
And that's a really interesting part of what I don't think politicians in Australia understand is a lot of the conservatives see it as a libertarian freedom issue. The left see it as a justice issue and from a policy point of view that there's alternatives. But also now feeding into it is this massive growing global industry. Do you think that will feed through into Australian politics?
Oh yes, of course.
Ultimately,
yeah, eventually. Will it be next year, next month, in 10 years? I can't tell you when. And if you look at Australia traditionally, we have a history of being very progressive in that at a political level. I think we were the first place in the modern world to allow women to vote, which was South Australia. New Zealand was the first country. We were the second country. We adopted things like the 40-hour working week, annual leave.
Medicare,
the great reforms of Gough Whitlam, the great reform of Paul Keating, and mandatory superannuation, a solid retirement scheme. The US still don't have that, by the way. We do. So we have a history of these big picture progressive issues in moving forward, while some other places in the world take decades to catch up. We're a little bit slow on drug reform, but I think eventually, yeah, I mean, maybe our grandkids will be sitting around having this conversation and wondering why it wasn't legalised many, many years ago. Yeah, I think you'll be out of a job one day, mate.
Well, let's hope so. That's the goal, to get in there, to fight for justice, reform, and a good outcome. But
personally, at a personal level, I hate needles. That's why I'm not into marijuana.
Well, on that note, Glenn Drury, thank you so much. The preference whisperer, the preference amalgamator, the preference pirate, I like to call you, for coming into the weeds to talk about your story, to talk about electoral politics, and to talk about what we're heading towards in the federal election. Really appreciate it.
Mate,
thank you very much.
It was a pleasure, a real pleasure. I enjoyed this chat. And let me just give a little plug. Can I give a plug?
Absolutely, mate.
I've got a book coming out in a few months' time which talks about all kinds of funny stories about how we got some of the parliaments we got, why certain things happened, why a lot of things didn't happen. I might even put something in there about you.
Well, let's hope not. But
it'll be good.
No, look, mate, if you want to be a regular, we'll get you back on to talk about your book. Love to.
Thanks for having me in. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, Glenn.